it was a horrible year for scoring. So in terms of scoring, it was, well, the worst year we've ever had. So regardless of all the changes that have been brought in and Stephen Hawking and how aggressive he was with the rules and the stand rule and the 6 and 6 and the new kick out rules and all of that, it didn't equate to higher scores, which is what we said the whole time. And there was so many people that said, "Oh, give the stand rule a chance. It's going to be great." So not only do we have ridiculous 50-metre penalties for players sneezing on the mark and umpires screaming stand 150 times per game, it did nothing to improve the game. So it made umpiring harder. It was harder to watch. You got sick of the umpires yelling stand. It was harder for the players to actually play the game. You're requiring teams to play with 17 players, not 18, which is a joke. And we had the lowest Coleman medalists on 58 for a long, long time, and scores have never been lower.
But this was
scrap the rule.
Yeah, but this was a strange season because absolutely you can see how that would work in theory. Effectively, you're taking out a defensive action when you bring in the stand rule. Make it easier for forward entries, make it easier for all those types of things. For whatever reason, it still didn't work. Every single season when there's tactics brought in to try and make it more offensive, there will be other sort of forms that will make it as defensive as ever. And what about the early part of the season where forwards were kicking bags?
Josh Bruce kicked 10.
Remember?
How
Taylor
good's this?
Walker was going to kick 100.
Steve Hawking's a genius.
But then it all just changed.
It changed because coaches come up with things like, well, let's not even stand the mark. Right? So let's, which is what we said would happen. Like, I wish we had tapes of you and I discussing this because for the first time in our lives, we were right about this. It was a joke of a rule when it first came in. You could see how bad it was in the preseason. They didn't trial it at all in any of the preseason games. They just brought it in, bang, this is happening. The players hated it, and it didn't work. So if I was on the competition committee, you cut your losses, don't you? There's no point doubling down on this, which is what they're going to do because they've brought it in for the AFLW season. They're absolutely going to double down on it. But if they had any conviction, if they had any foresight, they'd say, look, we had a crack at this. This didn't work. We're getting rid of the stand rule. And the other one's the medical sub as well, which didn't work exactly the way it was intended to work. There's grey areas all over the medical sub. Now, should it just be a concussion sub? And should that be the only reason that the medical sub should come on? Second part to that is, should you get a game next to your name if you are the sub? Should you get a premiership medal like we saw in the grand final? All of that. So that would be another area that I'd be looking to discuss and really tighten up on the medical sub.
I can't believe that with the soft cap, effectively, with everything that's going on, cuts and all these types of things, that they would bring in the medical sub and say, well, look, doesn't matter what happens if you don't spend a second on the ground, you'll still get a match payment, etc.
And a game.
It's a little bit strange. There's no need for 5 people on the bench. 4's fine. I don't want to see the medical vest again, like the super sub. That was just terrible. But it's going to stay, isn't it? The medical sub's going to stay.
The medical sub will stay because the coaches want it, but I think they can tighten it. Initially, it was designed just to be a concussion sub, and once again, a couple of days before the season, they bring in this rush decision to have it. So I'd be looking at that, and then of course the rules and umpiring will also be on the agenda. The holding the ball rule, prior opportunity, all of that. The MRO should be on the list. It's a really confusing year for the MRO and the inconsistencies there that we saw with players such as Toby Green and others with raising arms in tackles and also concussion and head knocks and things like that. So that'll all be topical. What rules do you like? What don't you? 0427 154 166. And what changes would you make if you were on the competition committee?
I think by the start of the year, the whole concussion rule, the mandatory 12-day period sitting out and everything was controversial, and from the start, it was, well, what's going to happen if it's a big game and someone has to sit out this, potentially if it's a grand final? By the end of the season, it was much more normal and much more acceptable. And by the end of next season, it'll absolutely be, well, look, if you get knocked out or you show some signs of concussion, absolutely you're not playing next week.
Yeah, I think that you're right.
More acceptable.
I think you're right on that. I guess we were fortunate that there was no issues where a player would miss a grand final. Now, the week off prior to the grand final helps with that as well. So maybe that's there to stay, to make sure that we don't get a big player missing a grand final because of concussion. 1300 736 736. You can have your say on that.
Do you think the last touch rule ever come in? Or
Yep.
that'll be the Samfle's
I do.
own little pride and joy?
No, I do think that will come in because insufficient intent to keep the ball in play is one of those awful rules that is adjudicated differently from week to week. And being at the Sanford Grand Final and watching it again, it just works. It just absolute last possession out of bounds works. So I think the AFL's looking at that closely